Hi, everyone. Welcome this afternoon to the third in our series of possibly 4 webinars. We'll see what happens next week. Joining us today is Laurence Jones from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Bangor. He's a specialist working on air pollution effects on ecosystems and particularly ecosystem services, so how ecosystem function interacts with our ability to work with ecosystems and their ability to function normally. We're really looking forward to his talk about the long tendrils of nitrogen, how it affects our natural capital. If you do have any questions or are having trouble hearing the webinar, please type in the chat dropdown, and either Joe or Adam will help out to either collate your questions for Laurence to answer at the end of the webinar, or to help you get access to the webinar. Right, over to you, Laurence.
Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to talk to you about nitrogen and natural capital. So I'll just give a little bit of introduction about my sort of scientific journey to this point, I guess. So I started working on nitrogen impacts on ecosystems way back in 1992. So I did a master's project, MSc project, on effects of nitrogen on a montane moss, Racometrium lanuginosum. I've been working on nitrogen on and off for about over 28 years. And more recently, I've been working on ecosystem services and natural capital. And so this talk is really about sort of understanding how nitrogen affects all the deep components of our ecosystem, and then the knock-on effects on functions, and then on ecosystem services and the benefits we get from ecosystems. So I'll give a little bit of introduction, so I won't spend too long on this. The sort of types of the components of atmospheric nitrogen and some of the sources. So you probably have heard a lot of this from previous seminars, or apologies if you're already familiar with this, so I won't spend too long on it. But basically, atmospheric nitrogen comes in 2 forms. So it comes in wet deposition in rain, and that can be dissolved ammonium or nitrate, or dissolved organic nitrogen. And then the other sort of components are dry deposition from gases and aerosols. So nitrogen dioxide, ammonia, and then the air there's a large range of aerosols, including ammonium nitrate. That's one of the sort of dominant sources of aerosol nitrogen. So the graphic shows a study we did in South Wales. So we worked on a sand dune system for a year, working at a full nitrogen budget. So all the nitrogen coming in rain and dry deposition. So just a kind of couple of messages from this. The first one is that reduced forms of nitrogen dominate the budget. So if you look at the orange sector and the blue sector, that's dry ammonia gas deposition and wet ammonium nitrate in rain. So reduced forms of nitrogen, so primarily from agricultural sources, they make up about 2/3 of the nitrogen input to the site. Dry deposition is about half of that in total. If you look at the grey sector, top left, so that is dissolved organic nitrogen. And that's something that we tend not to measure routinely. So most of the sort of atmospheric chemistry monitoring doesn't tend to measure the dissolved organic nitrogen in rain. But that can actually make up quite a large proportion of the nitrogen at sites which are cleaner. It can be up to 1/3 of the nitrogen that's in the wet deposition component. A quick look at the main sources of atmospheric nitrogen. So I understand there's already been a seminar on APIS, which touched on APIS. So this is a really useful website. And you can enter a grid reference for a particular site or the name of a site and work out what the sort of modeling attribution studies suggest the main sources of nitrogen are to that site. So this is an example for newborn Bexes, which is a groundwater dependent wetland. And the biggest sector there is livestock, so it's ammonia from livestock. And then you have a series of other sources. So some of these are agricultural related, so fertilizer. Some of them are from shipping, road transport, etc. So again, this sort of shows you that for a different site, agricultural sources are really important. So that's just a little bit of background. So I'm going to start just providing a bit of evidence on nitrogen impacts on biodiversity. And that's perhaps biggest in people's consciousness, is that, you know, that everyone's interested in what the effects are on biodiversity. I should say that the sort of biodiversity focus for a lot of nitrogen studies is relatively recent. So it kicked off with Carly Stevenson's paper in 2004 in Science, which was a really nice study. But the nitrogen community had been studying impacts on ecosystem function and a lot of the soil processes for a good sort of 10 to 20 years before that, initially triggered by an interest in acid rain, so sulfur and associated nitrogen compounds. So Carly's study was really quite groundbreaking, and it really brought the impacts on biodiversity to a much wider audience. So she did this really nice study. She looked at 65 sites, carefully designed so that you could look at impacts across a gradient of nitrogen deposition. And it showed quite a big impact on species richness. So initially, there was a straight line fitted through the data in Carly's original paper. Subsequent analysis of this data and sort of surveying of a wider set of grasslands suggests that actually a curvilinear relationship is more appropriate. But whichever relationship you put through the data, if you compare the cleanest sites and then the sort of sites at the more impacted end of the gradient, you can see that you get a drop in around 50% of species richness from the original sites. So nitrogen is having a big impact on our biodiversity, on our plant biodiversity at a national scale. So the work's sort of been extended and similar studies have been carried out in other systems. So the impacts aren't restricted to acid grassland. So this is a study which looked at 4 different habitats in a structured way, same sort of gradient study, designing the gradient so that sites were controlled as much as possible for differences in rainfall, differences in temperature. So these are all factors which can affect the nitrogen response, or the response of the ecosystem to nitrogen. So the studies were all designed in the same way, with around 25 sites. The acid grassland, top right, used a subset of Carly's sites and just reanalyzed the data. But this shows that you basically get a very similar relationship. So heathland, top left, dune grassland, and bogs. So in all of the studies, you get a clear and consistent drop in species richness, plant species richness, with increasing nitrogen deposition. The average deposition at UK sites is, say, around 15 kilos per hectare per year. So again, if you compare the cleanest sites with the average, we've lost between 20 and 50% of our species richness. If you look at the more impacted end of the gradient, those numbers can be anything up to 70, 80% of our species richness has been lost due to nitrogen. So that summarizes impacts on plant species richness. It's harder to study impacts on other components of biodiversity, partly because they're higher up trophic levels, so the impacts aren't direct, they're indirect. So they're mediated by changes to, for example, plant communities. But there is some evidence emerging. So there's some really nice work being done in the Netherlands on butterflies, by Chris Van Sway. This is the latest analysis he's done, but he's been working on this for some time now. So this analyzes butterfly counts in the Netherlands, and it's accumulated data across the whole of the Netherlands since 1990. And if you look at the blue line, that shows the butterfly species which are nitrogen sensitive species, and there's been quite a strong decline in those since 1990. Some butterflies aren't nitrogen sensitive. You could say they're nitrogen tolerant. So for example, the peacock butterfly, red admiral, both of those, their larval food plant is nettles, or nettles are important as a larval food plant. So if nettles are increasing, potentially those butterfly species can increase. And the data shows there is an increase in their populations, but more recently there's a bit of a decline as well. So there's clearly other factors operating in our wider landscapes which are causing a decline in butterfly species. But being able to sort of separate the impacts on nitrogen tolerant and nitrogen sensitive species gives us an idea of the added impact from nitrogen. If we move even higher up the sort of trophic cascade, there is some evidence as well for impacts of nitrogen on birds. So again, this is from the Netherlands. And there's a sort of a neat story that's been put together about the impacts on red-backed shrike. So this is mediated initially by increases in marram grass. So this is a sand dune species along the sort of barrier islands of the Netherlands and into Denmark. And nitrogen increases the growth of marram grass, which means that you get less bare sand. So that then has an impact on the invertebrates and other prey items like lizards and things. So generally you get a larger, the larger prey items, so the sort of lizards and larger insect larvae tend to decline as there's less bare sand. So you get this sort of cascade of impact through the system. So more grass, less bare sand, fewer large prey items, which means the birds need to work harder to feed their young, and so there's an impact on the population. This was never published in a single paper, but the story is sort of put together quite nicely in the European Nitrogen Assessment. So if you want to know more about this, I suggest you have a look at chapter 20, led by Nancy Dice. So that's the kind of the charismatic stuff, you know, the interesting biodiversity. I'm going to spend the rest of the talk on perhaps the more hidden aspects of nitrogen impacts. So looking at soil processes and the effects that has. This is another example from sand dunes, so apologies from this. That's also an area where I've worked quite a lot. So this is an example from semi-fixed dunes. So these are quite similar to the picture I showed in the previous slide about red-backed shrikes. There's quite a bit of bare sand, but there's still some plant cover. There's some soil, but not very much. It's usually only about 1 centimeter thick. So in that kind of early successional system, it's quite easy to see the effects of accumulating organic matter in the soil. So it's easier to detect an impact of the nitrogen. The basic story is that when you get nitrogen deposition to an ecosystem, it doesn't disappear. It stays in the system. Some of it is leached out of the bottom, so there are implications for water quality. And the vast majority of the nitrogen that gets put into a system gets stuck in the plant and the soil pools. So this was a gradient study conducted in sand dunes. So we separated the sites at the low end of the deposition inputs and the sites with higher nitrogen deposition. And you can see the budget that we calculated for these different sites. So in the sites receiving greater levels of nitrogen, the plant biomass is bigger, the nitrogen pool stored in the soil is bigger because the plants are growing faster, they're putting more biomass into the soil, that's breaking down and accumulating and forming a thicker organic layer. There is greater leaching, so if you look at the arrow at the bottom, the leaching numbers are higher, but they're still not enough to lose all of that excess nitrogen. So nitrogen is still accumulating in the system. So I mentioned the nitrogen community has been studying nitrogen impacts on soil for a long time, for many decades now. So we know a lot about how nitrogen affects soil and soil processes. So this rather complex diagram summarizes a lot of those processes. So let's focus on the dotted line on the sort of left-hand side of the diagram. This summarizes the carbon and nitrogen cycling processes. So production, plant growth, litter production, litter breakdown, and the cycle of soil development within that, and nitrogen and carbon cycling on an annual basis. If we're thinking about this in a ecosystem services framing, those processes equate to the supporting services. Now, immediately around the edge of this box to the top on the right, you can see some of the intermediate functions and intermediate impacts that changes in the soil nitrogen cycling have. So for example, you get increased leaching if you have increased available nitrogen in the soil. You get changes in the flowering of plants growing there, changes in the species composition, changes in herbivory and pathogens. And then right around the outside, you see the ecosystem services that those functions and processes have an influence on. The solid lines represent positive impact or positive influence. The dotted lines represent a negative influence. So there's a lot of interconnection here, but hopefully you can see that those basic soil processes affect a series of intermediate functions, which then have an impact on ecosystem services around the outside of the diagram. Some of those are positive, some of those are negative, sometimes different routes through this kind of impact cascade can have either positive or negative impacts on the same ecosystem service. This is a diagram for one of the mechanisms of impact of nitrogen. So this is eutrophication. This is the buildup of nitrogen and nutrients in the soil and plant system. The two other main impacts are acidification, so nitrogen acidifying the soil, and then direct toxicity, which is direct impacts on, for example, lichens and sensitive bryophytes. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about eutrophication, but I will briefly touch on acidification towards the end. I'm going to bring in a few examples of data where we've collected which illustrate some of these impacts. So much of this data comes from a series of long-running nitrogen experiments. So there was the UCreate consortium, which was a series of experiments funded partly by DEFRA, partly by other sources. And this is the sort of the main nitrogen community originally in the UK. So organisations right across the UK, including CEH, universities, etc., and funded by DEFRA, but also by Welsh Government and various other funding bodies, including some industry bodies. So there were 9 experiments in this data set. They covered heathlands, bog, grassland, dune grassland, and some of the results for about 10 years of data are summarized in this paper by Gareth Phoenix. So if you're interested in finding out more detail, that's a good start, a good introduction to these experiments. I'm just going to pull out a few examples from these experiments of data just to illustrate some of the impacts on these hidden soil processes. So back to the diagram. I gave a few examples of impacts on plant diversity. So this shows the route through this sort of network diagram for impacts on plant diversity. So with increased nitrogen, you get more available nitrogen in the soil. Plants take it up. The competitive species grow faster, taller, and they shade out the low-growing species, the slow-growing species. And usually that's things like orchids, the species which are of most conservation interest. And then if you look at the ecosystem services on the outside of the diagram, I've highlighted in blue the ecosystem services that are affected. So in this case, we're interested in the aesthetics of wildflower meadows. We're interested in biodiversity. Those are cultural services. So this is a different set of impacts now. And this is looking at accumulation of nitrogen in plant tissue. So we call this folia N. So we have the same route. We have an increase in the available nitrogen in the soil. The plants take that up. And when there's a lot of nitrogen in the system, they start to accumulate that in plant tissue. That has impacts on provisioning services. So actually there's benefits for crop production, for grassland systems where essentially the grass is getting free fertilizer. But there are also negative consequences as well. So I've highlighted in the sort of orangey brown color some of the feedbacks into the system. So if you get increased nitrogen stored in plant tissue, you also get increased pathogens, increased herbivory from insects. That feeds back to negative impacts on productivity, some positive impacts on litter production. So if the plant litter, the sort of dead growth at the end of the year, if that has a higher nitrogen content, it tends to decompose faster, which then means that you've got more nitrogen in the soil system. So you start to get mostly positive feedbacks into the system. So nitrogen impacts persist for a long time because you get this cycling and because you get these series of feedbacks in the system. So just a bit of data from the experiments just to show how nitrogen does affect nitrogen deposition does affect the amount of nitrogen stored in plant tissue. This particular graph shows each of the experiment types, different habitat types. On this one, it's got tissue nitrogen as the absolute quantities. I'll explain the format for the other graphs later. So the open symbols are grassland experiments, and generally you get a greater increase in the nitrogen content. So it increases from around 1% up to 2.5% or more in grasses. In heathlands, you also get an increase in nitrogen, but not quite as much. But they still have, you still get the same consequences. It's just the response is different. So let's look at another set of routes through the chain. Looking more directly at impacts on plant production and plant growth. So we know plants grow bigger. They produce more biomass with nitrogen as long as other nutrients aren't limiting. So the knock-on effects are on provisioning services, but also a series of impacts if you look bottom right. So potentially on water supply. If plants are growing more, they're transpiring more. So there's less water to go into the groundwater. Hazard regulation, potential impacts on, there's a potential benefit there. If plants are growing faster or colonizing land, bare soil quicker, then you get less runoff. So there's a positive benefit there. Potential impacts, positive and negative on carbon sequestration and on clean air, on pollution removal. So again, you get these sort of feedbacks through the carbon and nitrogen cycling. And I'll just show you some data from the experiments, which sort of puts a magnitude on this. So there's this, I'll show a series of graphs following this, which have a slightly different format to the one I showed for tissue nitrogen. So these are all in the format of a log ratio. And I've done this to show what the impact is, because all the experiments sort of start at a different point, and you've got grassland and you've got heathland. So the actual absolute values can be quite different. So if you express it as a difference from the control treatment, so the treatment where we didn't add any extra nitrogen, if you express for each experiment what the changes are relative to the control, that's a neat way of standardizing the data so you can see it all on one graph. So for a log ratio which is positive, so above the 0 line, that means there's an increase in biomass. And a negative log ratio means there's a decrease in biomass. So there's a bit of scatter in the graph, but basically you can see that grassland and heathland both follow the same sort of response. So as you increase nitrogen, you get an increase in biomass. However, if you notice towards the really high treatment level, so up to 140 to 180 extra kilos of nitrogen added to the system, you start to get a decrease again. And this is because you start to get nutrient limitation from other key nutrients in the soil. So you might get phosphorus limitation or potassium limitation, for example. That restricts the amount of extra biomass that plants can put on, and in some cases you can get toxicity effects due to an imbalance in the nutrients that the plant's able to extract from the soil. So you don't get a continuous increase in biomass. Sometimes you can get quite complex relationships. Let's look at a slightly different impact now. So this is looking at increased leaching. So if there's more nitrogen in the soil, there's more available nitrogen. So when we say available nitrogen, it's in a form that plants can take up very easily, and bacteria also can use. If there's more available nitrogen than the plants can take up, essentially you get excess nitrogen. That will then leach out to the bottom. There's also a timing element to this. So in the middle of summer, plants are growing really quickly, so they're taking up all the available nitrogen they can find. Towards the end of the summer, though, towards autumn, early winter, the plants are starting to shut down, but you still might have extra nitrogen in the system. So the plants aren't taking it up. That then leaches out to the bottom. So most of the leaching actually happens in winter because the plants and the bacteria have slowed down their physiology. They're not taking up that nitrogen. So that's when you tend to get the leaching, which then has implications for nitrates in groundwater or water quality in rivers. This is another log ratio diagram. So this shows leaching as you increase the amount of nitrogen deposition in the experiment. And above around 25 to 30 kilos of nitrogen, you start to get a big increase in the amount of nitrogen that's leached out of the bottom, because the system is essentially becoming saturated with nitrogen. The plants and the microbial processes can't take it up. I mentioned acidification, so I'll just do one example on acidification, and then I'll sort of start to pull this together to look at a wider set of impacts or in a larger framework. Nitrogen causes acidification of soil by a number of different mechanisms, so I'm not going to go into the detail, but most of the acidification happens when you get conversion of ammonium into nitrate, and then that nitrate is leached out of the system. So most of the acidification happens with leaching of nitrate. The changes in soil pH are obviously worse for acidic systems because they don't have a buffering capacity. So in base-rich systems, in limestone, you have lots of base cations, and they buffer the effect of the acidity, and you don't tend to get much nitrate leaching. As soon as you get increased nitrate leaching, then you start to change your soil pH. Now, I haven't highlighted all of the linkages in this because soil pH is central to all of this. So basically, everything on this diagram is affected by nitrogen once your soil pH starts to change. So just a bit of data backing this up. So again, it's a log ratio diagram. So values below the line show a change in pH, a decrease in pH. That shows that the system is acidifying. So the three red dots are from Newborough Warren. So this is a calcareous sand dune system. So even though you add extra nitrogen here, because it's calcareous, it's base rich, there's no change in pH. The blue, the green, and the other symbols are from Wardlow, which is a partially decalcified site. So there you're getting some acidification of the topsoil, and that's enhanced by nitrogen. So you're starting to get a decrease in the pH. So I'll start to summarize now. If we look at this from an ecosystem services perspective, there's a range of impacts. So some of them are benefits. So I mentioned briefly some of the potential benefits to agriculture. It's free fertilizer. But because it's a fertilizer, because it's a nutrient, that is the basis of many of the impacts on semi-natural ecosystem. So this sort of lists some of those impacts on trees, on diversity, water quality, and then there's impacts to our built infrastructure as well, to human health from PM 2.5 pollution, damage to buildings from nitrogen dioxide and acidity. There's a wide set of impacts, some good, some bad. If you start to quantify these and put them all together, you can see that there's a mixture of positive and negative. This is the benefits from, so this puts us into a framing of calculating the benefit from reductions in nitrogen deposition. So what's the impact of policy? Has policy to reduce emissions of nitrogen actually had a beneficial effect? So the values below the line they're essentially losses, economic losses, because we've reduced nitrogen deposition. So there's a slight reduction in the amount of carbon sequestration because trees are growing less, grass is growing less, heathlands are growing less. Some reductions in livestock production. So these are the values below the line. However, when you factor in the benefits from that change in policy to reduce emissions, we can see the benefits far outweigh the costs of this. And the biggest of these is for biodiversity. So huge benefits to biodiversity from the policies we've implemented so far to reduce nitrogen deposition. This was a piece of work that followed on from that. And this was work done for DEFRA. So we did a more sort of spatially targeted assessment of the benefits of policy to reduce nitrogen emissions. So we looked around the country at the areas that would where emissions would go down. So this is a combination of reduction in oxidized nitrogen emissions, but also agricultural emissions of ammonia. So the map top left shows the change in nitrogen deposition. Darker green is good. It means there's a bigger decrease in the nitrogen deposition. The map next to that with the purple shows the economic value when you factor in the changes in diversity. So when ecosystems start to recover, the expected increase in species richness, and then the value using various economic value transfer techniques to work out what the benefit of that per species is. So this shows a sort of spatial map of which parts of the UK benefit most in terms of species richness when you reduce nitrogen emissions. And then the graph on the bottom right shows when you convert that into an economic value per unit of nitrogen deposition, you basically get the greatest benefit when you're looking at the clean end of the gradient. So this has implications for policy design. And there's a long discussion about this as to, do you protect the cleanest sites, or do you try and remediate or try and minimize the damage to sites that already have quite a high impact? If you go purely on this argument, it's better to spend your resource protecting the cleaner sites, because that's where you get the greatest return for your money. There's a lot of discussion around this issue, so there's other views on this, but this is one way of looking at it. So that's it from my slides. I'm happy to take questions, and I'll hand over to Adam, who I think is chairing the question and answer. So thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Laurence. I have actually already had a question through, so we'll begin with that. In the meantime, though, if anyone has any further questions, if they could use the chat function, that would be perfect.
I'm assuming you mean political inertia here. Why aren't we decreasing nitrogen deposition? I guess there's a number of aspects to this. So one is perhaps awareness of the impact hasn't been that great. Certainly up until recently, some site managers on protected sites didn't necessarily see nitrogen as a big problem. It's harder to detect slow change over time. And other aspects like lack of grazing, they partly mask impacts of nitrogen deposition, but they also exacerbate them. So I think part of it is an awareness issue. There's also a tractability issue. So there's been big decreases in the amount of oxidized nitrogen emissions. Oxidized nitrogen emissions have gone down by around 70% since 1990. So there's been a big change in the amount of deposition coming from combustion sources. And that's mainly because they're either large sources like power stations, which are easy to control, or sort of the diffuse sources like vehicles, but there's the technology to reduce emissions from vehicles, catalytic converters, for example. That then leaves the ammonia, which now makes up, as I mentioned, around 2/3 of the deposition. But it's a lot harder to control ammonia. It's much more of a diffuse source. So I think it's a combination of things, but I absolutely agree that the benefits do outweigh the costs. Okay, impacts on, I'll start at the top. Impacts on water storage and flood risk. I think it partly depends on the community you're talking about. So if this is in the context of peatlands, which I guess it is, peatlands are, naturally a good water store. They're also, when they're full of water, they're not much of a water store, because that sponge is already full. So I think the sort of nuances of a change from intact peatlands to degraded peatlands, I think it's perhaps not so clear cut on that aspect. So, again, others might disagree with that. I think that the magnitude of plant growth in most systems due to nitrogen, it might have some effect on reducing overland flow, but it's probably not a big effect. So there is a conceptual link to the ecosystem service there. I think it might be hard to demonstrate that at large scale. In terms of the second question, there's been quite a lot of work in the heathlands, in the Peak District, for example, and the Pennines, looking at water quality and the streams draining the blanket bog and the heathlands there. So at a landscape scale, there's certainly evidence for increased nitrate in the catchments of quite a few upland areas in the UK. So there's the Acid Waters Monitoring Network, which is a network of sites originally set up to look at impacts of sulfur deposition, but because they're measuring a large number of compounds, they can also pick up changes in nitrogen over time. And there's been a decrease in those upland monitoring sites. There's been a decrease in the amount of nitrate in the water, demonstrated since 1990, when part of the deposition component has been going down. So there is evidence of changes in water quality as a result of both nitrogen deposition in the first place, but also changes in policy, which means there's now less nitrate from atmospheric sources in those upland locations. Third question, aerial deposition for marine habitats. And then you mentioned shipping, that sort of 6% of nitrogen comes from shipping. So I guess there's two aspects to this question. So one is shipping a significant source of nitrogen? And the answer is yes, and that's a source that hasn't really been controlled. So it's also a source of sulfur. So actually most of the sulfur we get now in the UK, a good chunk of that comes from shipping, because shipping tends to burn quite dirty coal at the moment, and oil. Not coal, sorry, oil. In terms of atmospheric deposition being an issue for marine habitats, it partly depends on the habitat and whether it's how open a system it is. So salt marshes, as well as atmospheric deposition, you get all of the inputs from marine systems with the incoming tide. But despite that, there are a number of manipulation experiments which have shown that if you add extra nitrogen onto salt marsh, you still get faster grass growth, changes in species composition. So even in these more open systems, there's still an impact of atmospheric deposition on those ecosystems. Fourth question about the impact of deposition on peat soils and bogs. There's been a couple of interesting studies which show that if you have quite high levels of nitrogen deposition, it can actually start to mobilize stored carbon. So decomposition rates increase and you start to get greater CO2 emissions of the carbon in the upper layers. In terms of impacts on ecosystem components of bogs, so I mentioned the effects on plant species richness. As well as overall species richness, you get changes in the species composition. So you start to get more weedy species with a higher nitrogen demand coming in. And that's part of the reason why the shape of the curve for bogs is considered different from the other habitats, because you're still getting species in there, but they're undesirable species. And then the last question on the list at the moment, if I could pick one single measure to decrease the impact of nitrogen. That's an interesting one. Ammonia is the big source at the moment. So ways of controlling ammonia. There's some interesting trade-offs here. So there's sort of ethical issues about what you think is most important. So I'll give a couple of examples. Free-range chickens give off more ammonia than chickens in battery units. So not per chicken, but because of the housing system. So in a large battery unit, you can fit scrubbers to reduce the ammonia from the battery farm. Where chickens are outdoors, it's much harder to control the ammonia emissions. So there's perhaps ethical trade-offs that, in terms of welfare issues, the better system might be free range, but in terms of nitrogen issues, it's not. And I guess if there's ways of controlling emissions from dairy, again, that suggests if you're interested in trying to minimize ammonia, you want to move to housed systems where you can control the ammonia and scrub it out at source. But again, that might have ethical implications for how the milk is produced. Okay, so the sort of differences in where the nitrogen is reduced and where the benefits are. I think that was one of the interesting aspects of this study, was showing the spatial mismatch in all of these. So you get a spatial mismatch in quite a few steps in the process. So that's for a number of reasons. So where the change in emissions is highest isn't necessarily the same place that the change in deposition is greatest, because you get atmospheric transport. So that's one reason for a spatial difference. The next reason is that in some areas you might get a large change in deposition, but the habitats in that area are less sensitive. So if you're looking at a per unit change in deposition, the spatial pattern reflects where habitats are more sensitive than others. And then the last part, and also where you are on that deposition curve for that habitat. And then the last component is when you're then changing it into an economic value, some habitats, some habitats are more species rich than others. So that would then provide a sort of greater weight for those areas where the habitat has a lot of species and you're at the low end of the deposition curve. So one unit change in nitrogen deposition would have a much greater value for that habitat in that location. Question about biodiversity and the valuation study. So for this, we used a willingness to pay study conducted by Mike Christie to get a per change in species value. So his original willingness to pay study was about nature protection and how much people were willing to pay to see an increase in species populations or to prevent a decrease in species population. So we adapted those willingness to pay values to then apply it to a per unit change, which is affected by nitrogen. Now, in terms of how they compared to human health benefits, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the value of a human life is considered much greater than the value of a plant species. So overall, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but I think the damage cost for nitrogen for impacts on species, plant species, was around £400 or £500 per kilo of nitrogen emitted, whereas for human health, it was probably 3 to 5 times that. I apologize, I can't remember the exact numbers. But basically, the human health impacts almost always trump any ecosystem impacts. So a question on air pollution removal by vegetation. How effective is this at a range of scales? So this question, I guess, relates to work we've done more recently for Office of National Statistics, where we model the benefit of vegetation right across the UK and the amount of pollution it removes. So the biggest health impacts come from removal of PM 2.5, and that accounts for around 90% of the human health benefit. And the modelling showed that across the UK, all vegetation in the UK removes enough pollution to have a benefit of around £1 billion per year. And I think key to this is scale. So if you think only about vegetation in urban areas, that has a sort of net health benefit of around £200,000 per year. So it still has some benefit, but basically all of the vegetation outside of urban areas is also contributing to that. So this is a process that really operates at scale. You can downscale it to the benefit provided by an individual tree or an individual hectare of woodland, but it's not going to necessarily have the benefit in that same location. So there's a combination of issues here. And it's slightly off topic for this seminar, but basically all vegetation removes pollution in some way. Trees reduce the most, but the benefits don't necessarily happen in the same location as where the tree is. And then question 5, I guess we've got time to answer this one as well. How do nature-based solutions feed into the nitrogen reduction debate? Are there multiple benefits from implementing MBS and nitrogen management? Yes, there certainly are. I suppose one way to explore this is in the context of trees in the wider landscape. So I've just briefly mentioned the pollution removal benefits of trees. But trees provide a lot of different functions. So they're clearly very important for biodiversity, for a lot of our sort of woodland and open mixed habitat species. They provide some more direct benefits to people. So next to busy roads, for example, they mitigate noise levels by anything from sort of 1 to 7 decibels, depending on how thick the belt of woodland is. They store carbon. They mitigate flooding, potentially. They reduce overland flow. They're not going to stop the biggest floods, but for small to medium size rainfall events, they can actually slow the rate of overland flow, slow the water going into the rivers, and reduce the height of the flood peak. I think the interesting thing is that all of these have a spatial context. So the trees need to be in the right place to provide the service, to provide the maximum possible service. And different contexts and different locations are important for different services. So to me, the important thing is about planning. What are you most interested in? Where in the landscape do you put trees or plant vegetation to provide the most service? And also think about the potential disbenefits. So what tree species do you choose to plant, for example? So there's a whole series of disbenefits as well, which you need to take into account. So for example, asthma, allergies from pollen, conifers and some broadleaves as well produce a lot of biogenic volatile organic compounds. So they're a precursor for formation of secondary pollutants like ozone. So there's no simple answer to this, and it's about understanding what you want, which tree species or other species to plant, and where you want to plant them.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question, because we're bang on 2 o'clock at the moment, but we'll try and sneak another one in. So basically pick your favorite of this one, I think.
I'll do the first one because that should be quick. So the economic benefit seems to increase with the load. This isn't because of carbon sequestration. I think this is just a sort of quirk of the different equations we've used to calculate through this long sequence of impacts and benefits. So I wouldn't read too much into this. That line is reasonably flat. Natural response of different habitats. This is about recovery rates. Recovery is always a function of a whole range of different things. So available seed source is really important for any habitat for recovery. I think the biggest issue in terms of recovery rates for nitrogen is how long the nitrogen persists in the system. So for heathlands and woodland, for example, you have a canopy system. So the plants take up nitrogen, but then they recycle it in terms of litter and leaf fall. So plants with a canopy system the nitrogen effects tend to persist for longer. There's also the issue of how you manage a system and how easy it is to remove nitrogen from the system. So in grasslands with regular mowing, and if you take the material off site, that's a really effective way of removing nitrogen from the system and reducing the soil nitrogen pools. Heathlands and dune systems, you can also remove the soil itself. So turf cutting, sod cutting in heathlands is quite an efficient way to remove nitrogen, but you need to be careful about the seed bank. So it's partly about the rate of nitrogen cycling, how long it persists in the system, but also about what kind of management you can do partly to remove nitrogen, but also to mitigate the effects of nitrogen. So it's quite a complex set of issues. And I don't think there's any silver bullet for that. It kind of needs designing for that particular habitat in that context and that particular site.
Thank you to everyone for their attention, and thank you so much to Laurence for his time and for answering all these questions. There's some really great questions. Alexandra and I can try to follow up, and we are compiling questions and answers for these. So if you do have questions, in follow-up, please feel free to send them through. Right, well, if we were in the room, I would say, please everyone join me in thanking Laurence Jones for his talk today, and thanks so much to everybody for your attention. And I will clap from back here. But right, well,
thank you everyone, and thank you for the interesting questions. And I'm willing to answer more by email if you've got any more.
Perfect. We'll try not to bombard you, Lawrence. Right, I guess we'll call this webinar to a close then. Thanks, everybody.